she certainly had. So it's a great pleasure that I introduce you. And of course, if you need a ladies' room or men's room, it's out that door. So, and if you get thirsty, you're allowed to go out and get a little more wine. So, and I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Well, thank you, Jim, for the warm and generous introduction, and to Betty. I think Betty may still be out there for all the help organizing the event. Thanks to the association and to all of you for deciding to spend part of your St. Patrick's Day Eve with us, hearing about Cuba of all things. So thank you for being here. I'm here tonight to tell you a little bit about this the book that Jim mentioned, Cuba and American History, and to talk about a little bit about its contents, about how I wrote it, what the process was, and I'm thrilled to take any questions and comments at the end of my presentation. So I want to start by just pointing out that Cuba and American history is, simply put, a history of Cuba. It starts before Columbus and goes to the present day, to the basically to the election of Joe Biden. It takes us. So it's more than 500 years of history. It's not a textbook. It's not a specialized academic monograph. And despite the fact that I tell some personal stories in the book, and I tell some of my family's story in the book is not emphatically a memoir. It is rather a character-driven, episode-driven, narrative history of Cuba. And I think of it as written, and it's a history of Cuba written and reconceived for this very moment, when it seems like history itself is up for grabs. So I began writing the book during President Obama's opening to Cuba. Since then, of course, that policy ended. Fidel Castro died. Raul Castro is no longer in power. There was an opening, then there was a closing by Donald Trump. And now there's this strange limbo when President Biden is occupied by many, many other things, as we all know. The other thing that's happened in that time, of course, were the protests this summer in Cuba in November, first in November 2020, then in the summer of 2021. And I feel like all these changes and events together seem to demand a kind of reckoning with the history of Cuba and a reckoning with the relationship between Cuba and the US over a long period of time. So I want to talk today a bit about how I decided to write, or how I wrote about that reckoning. How do you write for a reckoning with history? So that's kind of what I want to talk about today. So I want to begin by saying that it's a history of Cuba that is written primarily for an American audience. It's published in the US, written in English, for a public that, truth be told, probably has a sketchy knowledge of what Cuban history is. And a lot of public conceptions of what Cuba is are characterized by myth, a lot of myth, caricature, etc. So I wanted to write the book to challenge American readers to see the island beyond those myths. I wanted to remind them of something very obvious, which is that Cuba existed before Fidel Castro, and that the relationship between Cuba and the United States has a much longer and much more complex history than many Americans imagine today. I also wanted the book to function as a kind of selective history of the US. Right? My idea was that Cuba and the US have been for so long entwined that to tell a history of Cuba is also, in a sense, to tell a selective history, an incomplete history, but nonetheless a history of the United States. A history of the United States told from the outside in. The history of the United States as viewed through the eyes of others. So I think of the book as the history of Cuba that can also function as a kind of shadow history of the United States. And the question is, how do I do that? How do I write this history of Cuba that's also kind of a history of the US? And part of the answer is that the book goes back and forth a lot between the two places. So some chapters begin in Cuba, some chapters begin in the US, and almost every chapter includes history from both countries. And I do the back and forth, not to necessarily to compare, but to tell interconnected, overlapping stories that allow readers to glimpse how different history can look depending on where you're standing. So that's part of the purpose of the back and forth. And I often play with readers' perspectives and their expectations right from the start of every chapter. My point is not to surprise the reader just for surprise's sake, but rather to draw their attention to things that are a little unusual, things that don't fit easy categories. And so every chapter opening encompasses things that are both familiar and unfamiliar to the reader, to create a space of welcome for the reader, but also perhaps a space of slight discomfort. And so I want to tell you a little bit about the book has 33 chapters. Most of the chapters are very short, so they're easy to read in one sitting. And I hope that there's enough momentum that you keep reading the next chapter, right? After you're done with one. But I wanted to just talk to you about a few of the chapters, so you get a sense of how the book is written and how and a sense of the perspective that I developed. So I'll start with chapter 1. Okay. I was thinking of skipping chapter 1, but anyway. So chapter 1 begins with the arrival of Christopher Columbus in the New World in 1492. It's a history, of course, that is very, very familiar to American readers. It's a staple of elementary school social studies. Columbus's landing begins almost every general history of the United States, from the very first general history of the US, which was written by George Bancroft in 1834, to more recent ones written, for example, by the New Yorker writer Jill Lepore, just about 3 or 4 years ago. So I begin my chapter with that very familiar story, but I preface it with a very simple observation. And that is that Columbus never set foot anywhere that became the United States. And so that simple observation then raises a question. Why is it that a history that did not occur in the US, a history that did not occur in any place that would become the US, why did that history become the beginning of US history, as it's often told? And so what I discovered was that conception of US history beginning in 1492 actually originated in the 19th century, precisely as American statesmen were beginning to think about, or beginning to work on expanding US territory into the Caribbean and into places like Cuba. So you had people like George Bancroft thinking about taking over Cuba, thinking about Mexico, thinking about all these places, and all of a sudden, Columbus becomes the beginning of US history. So today, most Americans know the story of Columbus, but they know less about the later history of US territorial expansion that led history to be narrated as beginning with Columbus. So that's just an example of the first chapter, the way I kind of play with the perspective of what readers expect about the history of Cuba and the US. I'm going to jump a few centuries and go to the 19th century and talk about the beginning of one of my favorite chapters in the book. It's a chapter on the mid-19th century, a chapter on slavery in Cuba. But that chapter begins with the inauguration of a US president in March of 1853 in Washington, D.C. Does anyone know who that president was? Okay, it's okay. Franklin Pierce was inaugurated in March of of 1853. And so the chapter begins there. Um, the sectional conflict is getting heated up. No one quite there's a huge debate and an acrimony over the future of the country and the future of slavery. And in that inauguration, so I narrate a little bit about the inauguration, but it turns out there's someone missing from the inauguration. And that, I mean, his wife was missing for complicated reasons, but that's not who I'm thinking about. The vice president was missing. The vice president was a man named William Rufus King, who was an Alabama slaveholder and plantation owner. And instead of being at the inauguration in Washington, D.C., guess where he was? Cuba. He was on a plantation in Cuba, dying of tuberculosis. And at the time, in the 19th century, doctors recommended that people who had tuberculosis go to Cuba and take something called the sugar cure, which involved basically going to a sugar plantation in the Cuban countryside, going into the mill house where the sugar was being processed, and basically breathing the heat, the fumes, the vapors were supposed to cure the tuberculosis. Of course, it didn't work, but that's what he was doing. And so he got special permission from Congress to be inaugurated on a Cuban sugar plantation, the only time in this country's history where that's happened. So he took his oath of office on the highest point on the plantation in the middle of harvest season, overlooking people, bent over sugar and the smokestacks billowing their smoke. And then he died about a week later. And so I start the story there, not because it's the perfect illustration of how connected the systems of slavery in the US and in Cuba were. The US was very involved in Cuban sugar, in the illegal slave trade to Cuba, in building the machinery that processed the sugar, in building the railroads and owning the railroads that took the sugar to port. So to put a vice president, an American vice president, in the middle of the Cuban sugar plantation kind of makes that point in a way I think people don't forget. So anyway, so that's what I'm trying to do in the book. I want to bring it forward another, one more century to the 20th century and talk about the Cuban Revolution of 1959. Because in some ways, Americans have ideas about what Cuba is. Probably most of those ideas that they have about Cuba have to do with Fidel Castro and the revolution of 1959. So I felt kind of the burden most keenly, perhaps, in that part of the book. Right, to make people kind of let go of what they think they know and just read, just encounter people, encounter events, encounter history in a more immediate, urgent sense, and forget their expectations and their categories and so on. So that's what I tried to do in the revolution section. Again, going back and forth between the two places, but really, in a sense, in the Cuban Revolution chapter, I really wanted also to put special emphasis on everyday Cuban people. So we think about the revolution as an event in international relations. We think about the diplomatic crisis between Cuba and the US. I wanted to make sure that readers thought about what it would have been like to live through this in the moment. People at the time don't know what's going to happen 5 years from now, right? They're living it urgently. So I wanted to get to that. So I'm going to give you two examples of that, of how I do that. And there are two examples that have a lot to do with the US. One is the chapter on the Bay of Pigs invasion, and the other is the chapter on the missile crisis, which has been on people's minds lately for obvious reasons. So those are two very US focused chapters, but again, I try to kind of bring our attention to Cuban people. So how do I do that? The Bay of Pigs chapter, I begin by describing the place where the invasion landed. And it's an amazing place where it landed. It's an unusual place. It's the place that has changed for eons had changed so little. There's a lot of history there. So I began actually with the dinosaurs, right? There were dinosaurs that roamed the land where the Bay of Pigs invasion happened. And there are ancient species that still inhabit the area. And they're so unchanged over these millennia that scientists refer to them as living fossils because they've changed so little. And so I tell that in just one paragraph. I don't say a lot about the dinosaurs. It's just one, a brief mention, but I have a paragraph that describes the place. Then I describe when human beings arrive in this place. I talk about the indigenous people who live there. It's an area with a lot of rocky coral, and when the illegal slave trade, which was very important in Cuban history, thrived, the illegal slavers would bring captives on that coast, and they would have to walk barefoot across that coral. So I talk about them. There are generations of, the only industry in the area is charcoal. So for generations, people, they made a living by making charcoal. So I describe the charcoal workers. And so basically, and then I get to the fact that in December 1959, and most Americans don't know this, and it's unclear that even American intelligence at the time, the CIA and the State Department paid particular attention to this. Fidel Castro celebrated his first Christmas Eve dinner in power in the area of the Bay of Pigs, having dinner with charcoal workers. Okay, so I tell all this history that preceded the invasion. Why? To remind readers that invasions don't land on empty beaches. Actually, not only did it not land, I forgot a very crucial detail. They were building a hotel there, a big resort. And the American intelligence seemed really, they must have known, but they didn't think about it very much. So when the soldiers get off the ship and start, coming with their flotation, they're like these rubber rafts. They're trying to get to the beach. There was a party going on at the beach that they intended to land on because the resort was about to open, and the workers who'd been building it were celebrating it. So no invasion lands on an empty beach, literally and figuratively, right? The planners could not just will away history. That place had a deep, deep history, and Americans couldn't act like that history wouldn't shape the outcome of what happened. So that's the way I tell the Bay of Pigs story. And then of course I go on to explain, well, how could the US have failed so badly? And then I go over the conflicts between the State Department and the CIA, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and so on. And then finally, the missile crisis. That's usually narrated as a story of 13 days, right? The famous 13 days from the time Kennedy found out about the missiles to the time the crisis was, for the most part, resolved. So instead of starting with that, I begin in the tiny little rural town where the missiles were first discovered. And I begin by focusing on the people who live there. It's a tiny place. It's actually only about 10 miles from where my mother grew up, which I found out doing the research. I hadn't been aware of that before. Anyway, people are sleeping and hanging out and living their lives. And all of a sudden, in the middle of the night, there start to be traffic jams in this place in the middle of nowhere because these huge trucks are coming in. They're so big, they can't get around the corners in the small town. And all the trucks have these large beds in the back. And on the beds of the truck are these tarps that seem to be covering things that residents think look like palm trees, right? And of course, we all know they weren't palm trees, but I begin there in the town with those people trying to figure out what's going on. So they're peeking through their louvered windows, and the Cuban police are telling them to get back inside. And of course, they would soon learn that these were missiles. So again, trying to take our vision and our focus to the people who live this big history, this big epic history, most immediately, most urgently, who live that history with every fiber in their being day to day. So that's what I try to do in the book. And I hope that gives you a little bit of sense of how I wrote it. I just want to say one more thing, which is that, because in some ways I have focused a lot today on American readers, right? And I'm writing this book for an American public that doesn't know that much, or that tends not to know that much. I mean, some people obviously do, but in general, there's not a deep knowledge of it. But I also feel like I'm also writing it for Cuban readers and for Cuban American readers. And what I want to do with that, with that public, which includes people, like my parents and a lot of my family and so on, is to construct an account that is human, that is intimate, that I call it, epic history on a human scale. And my idea is that if you bring people into a story at that level, it puts categories and judgments on hold. Because my purpose is to get people to understand what it would have been like for everyday people to live through this history. Those people at the time did not know it was going to be communist, or did not know there was going to be this struggle between the Cuba and the US. They're just trying to live. They're just trying to survive. And so I want people to get into that story and to get into it, as I said, in a way that refuses all those binaries and all the political recrimination and polarization that we're also unfortunately familiar with. And so I always say that if I'm trying to get American readers to look at US history through if I'm trying to get American readers to look at US history through the eyes of another, right, by looking outside in from Cuba, I feel like part of what I'm trying to do with Cuban readers is to get them to look at history through the eyes of each other, to put on hold what they think they know and just try to imagine somebody else living through this period. Anyway, so that's what I tried to do in the book. The book is based on over 30 years of research, a lot of it in Cuban libraries and archives, but also in the US and in Spain. And I had a lot of fun writing it and reading about it. And I like, coming out and talking to people about it. So I'm eager to hear what questions you all might have. Yeah. Okay, the answer to that question will depend first on what Cuban you're talking about and at what moment. That's partly what I try to do in the book, right? You think about, like, Fidel Castro is not alive anymore. It's interesting, when Fidel Castro came to power, he came to power in January 1959, right? In February 1959, a magazine called Bohemia, which was the most popular magazine in Cuba, it's something like Life magazine, right? A combination between, like Life magazine, a lot of pictures and things like that. Anyway, they did a survey. And in the survey, this is late February, so he's been in power less than 2 months. 92% of the respondents said that the new government, Fidel's government, the revolutionary government, was doing everything perfectly well. 92%. Another, I don't know, so I think we know what happened later. So in retrospect, it's easy to forget the sense of hope and the sense of possibility that people had, the sense of engagement they had. So what I try to do is to kind of recover that, not to say that it's true or that justifies everything that happened later, but to try to understand it from the perspective of people who lived through it. So if you want a more scientific answer, you could do things like you could take indicators, like, it all depends on what indicators you take, right? So if you take indicators like gross national product, it's going to be a lot worse, right? After 59. If you take indicators like differences in education or life expectancy between Blacks and whites, there's hardly any difference in Cuba, right? That's very different than the US. So it partly depends on, the answer is going to depend on where you look and when you look. And so given that, I think as a historian, not as a scientist or, that the more interesting thing is to try to understand how this happened. How did a revolution that had 92% support become what it became? And what are all the things that contributed to that? So basically, I haven't really answered your question, but I hope I hope I've given you something to talk about. I mean, to think about rather. Does that make this? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Sure. Am I taking my own questions? Yeah. Okay. So over here. Well, I mean, there's one of the longest chapters in the book deals with the question of migration and with the Cuban community in Miami. It's a hugely important topic. I don't think you could understand Cuban history over the last 60 years if you don't spend a lot of time thinking and looking at Miami. I also don't think you can understand the Cuban Revolution without looking at Miami. So I think it goes both ways. Right now, the Cuban community in Miami, it's interesting. When Obama opened, there was support for the opening and there was a lot of enthusiasm. That changed. And when Trump initiated his closing, they supported the closing. And one of the things, and of course, in the 2020 election, the Cuban Americans favored Trump by a much larger margin than people expected. But what's interesting is that a lot of that support comes not from the old classic exiles, but from new arrivals. So something like, oh, I forgot the percentage. I think it's about maybe 40%. Don't quote me on this. I can't remember off the top of my head of Cubans and Cuban Americans living in South Florida are people who arrived after 1995. And they are, so them and even more recent arrivals are more likely to identify Republican. Sorry, I couldn't hear that. No. So the question was, is it easy to leave Cuba and come to Miami? No. And like what people are doing now, is Nicaragua, who's an ally of the Cuban government, has changed its rules and no longer requires visas for Cubans to go to Nicaragua. So what a lot of people are doing are trying to buy tickets to Nicaragua and then trying to cross the border into the US and then asking for asylum because they still have a right of asylum. But, it doesn't sound easy and it's not easy. So, yeah. Okay. No.
Thank you very much. This is so fascinating. I'd like to let everyone know that I'm happy. I've spent there for 7 years. My mother was an African American from New York, and she would take us November through February, 4 or 5 months, until we were 12. And the thing that has really bothered me is I've never understood it. Certainly remember when the channel that I showed, way down the age of recent, was that it seemed, please tell me, that was it the university system in Nevada and Cuba free at that time? I'm almost certain it was. And this is, I hope this is not very weird. I had a very sister, very close relationship with a woman, anatomy. She went to Northern District in New York, and we grew close forever. And she would take us, when she was supposed to take us to a park, to Camagüey or something, to visit her mother, see her house, visit her sisters. So we weren't like just seeing Miramar. We got to see lots of different They even took his comments to a cockfight when I was about 8 years old, and we were sworn that we could never discuss it. I told my mother I was about 4 inches was painted. But my question is, I could never understand this revolution because it seemed to me that people had small plots. They certainly have, like everybody says, chickens and I mean, nobody, I never saw anybody suffering. I'm sure there were suffering everywhere. But I don't understand. I mean, so obviously Batista was really corrupt and then it didn't help with the mafia. But how was it, why did they have such a thirst? Maybe because they didn't realize what Castro was going to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, so the question, tell me your name again. So Cynthia told a little bit of, her personal story and growing up as half Cuban, half American, but her question based on what she saw as a child when she used to visit up until from 46 to 58. 58 was that she saw that people had small plots of land, they had access to education. So she's asking, she doesn't understand where the desire for the revolution came from. And so I would say this, and I think that's part of what the book does. It tries to put the Cuban Revolution of '59 in a much longer history. And there's more than one explanation. But for example, one possible explanation is that there had been revolutions in Cuba before, right? So the wars of independence, which unfolded between 1868 to 1898, was a revolution, and it was fought by a multiracial, multi-class army. It espoused a language of equality, even of anti-racism that was remarkable for its time. But the struggle for independence ended up with the Spanish-American War and the entry of the US. When the US entered and declared war on Spain, they then didn't leave. So they occupied Cuba militarily for 4 years. And then they left in 1902 and imposed the Platt Amendment, which gave the US the right to intervene if life, liberty, or whatever was deemed to be in jeopardy. And the US intervened like 7 more times after that. And so there's a sense in Cuban history and in Cuban politics for a long time, there was a powerful sense of nationalism and patriotism that argued that, they appreciated the US's help in defeating Spain, but that the war was almost won by them. They hadn't needed the Americans, and the Americans had to leave, and they didn't want the Platt Amendment, right? The Platt Amendment, for example, well, it's what it set aside the land that became Guantanamo. It also prevented or forbade the Cuban government from entering into a treaty with any other third country. It didn't allow the Cuban government to incur debt with another country. So it really limited the power of the Cuban government. And even the American governor at the time said, the Cubans under the Platt Amendment only have a fiction of independence, right? So there was that sense of a revolution thwarted or a revolution frustrated. And then in the here I'm narrating all of you, but in the 1920s, there was a powerful movement of students and lawyers and professionals and sugar workers that was very much against the Platt Amendment and very patriotic and nationalist, et cetera. Anyway, eventually you get another revolution in 1933. And that one also gets frustrated. And it gets frustrated in part, and this is way too complicated to explain here, but it gets frustrated in part by an alliance between the US ambassador and Fulgencio Batista. And so, but it's interesting, that revolution began implementing some changes. So the beginning of an agrarian, like in the first 100 days, they started, doing worker employer profit sharing, the beginnings of agrarian reform, the right of women to vote. They said the Cuban army would train with the Mexican army and not the US army. So they started putting things in place, and that one was frustrated. Then there was a liberal constitution in 1940 that also allowed for some measure of agrarian reform, free education, health insurance, I don't remember if health insurance, but workers' compensation, an 8-hour workday, all those things in the Constitution, not as a law, but not like the New Deal, but like in the Constitution, 1940. But it was never enacted. I mean, it was passed, but the laws that would have made it real on paper were never enacted. So when Batista stages a coup in 1952, a lot of the country is against him. They begin fighting against him. Fidel Castro is only one person fighting against him. There's many, many others. And what they are calling for is the restitution of the 1940 Constitution. They're not calling for communism. They're calling for these ideas that have been circulating in Cuban history for generations. And so that's what appealed to people about the revolution. And the revolution came into power, and it started like, I think in the first 9 months, they put in place like 100 laws or edicts, including agrarian reform. And the first agrarian reform was not entirely radical. The one later would be much more, would eliminate much more private property. Urban reform that cut rents in half, right? So all those things were by and large popular. And if you, sorry, I know you have a question, I'm gonna say, but I just want to show you, in Bohemia, they took up a collection of money to support the agrarian reform. And the magazine published pages and pages of people who contributed. And you look at it and it's like the employees of the peluqueria, the hair salon of Betty's Hair Salon, $45. The employees of the coffee shop at the bus station, $10. Cubans in Chicago, $50. Veteran of the Wars of Independence, 50 cents. Like people, by and large, people supported it, even wealthy people initially. Of course, not necessarily if they took your land away, but the urban middle class was very much for it. And so I think that's what explains that enthusiasm, that these were goals and desires and demands that had been made for generations. And then, of course, but no one at the time foresaw what would happen by 1961, right? When he declares it to be communist and no more US, et cetera. Yes. Go ahead.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Great.
I usually can't capture early 60s, 60s, 60s. We had a I didn't. They blended well with the
Yeah.
but I couldn't figure out why
Yeah.
they were sent there.
They were sent by themselves without their,
Families come down, they all have stories.
yeah,
And it's like listening to, TV show.
yeah.
There was a part where Fidel Castro, after he had a difference between Moscow and with
Mm-hmm.
it was a serious thing.
Mm-hmm.
Castro
Mm-hmm.
Moscow.
Mm-hmm. I think so. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
One more question is there any public commentary today out of Cuba in response to that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So initially they seem to be very, like the first day, they were very uncritical of Russia's position, but then since then, they keep talking about the need. They're not going to be explicitly critical, but they keep talking about the need for peace, the need for peace, the need for peace, which people take, given how much Cuba needs assistance right now, they're at least trying to maintain a modicum of independence, but they certainly will never come out in favor of Ukraine or explicitly against Russia. What they're saying is just, we hope that a diplomatic solution prevails. We hope we can get to peace. Nobody wants this war, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, but it's, I mean, it's interesting to think about the Cuban Missile Crisis in this moment, and you know how things can escalate in unforeseen ways, and yeah, and it's such a, I think that so much has changed since 1962. I don't know. I hate to think about it anyway. Yeah.
Seemed like many of the students that came early on were getting there because they were Batista. Some like the one who did quite well.
Yeah.
And then later came and I'm not, I see people who are done. So now it's my lawyers. Was there a way for these people segments of society? Was it later?
Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely been waves and there's been differences over time. So initially, something like, you know, by I forget the year, 1961, 1962, there are studies that have shown that, for example, like 90% of the University of Havana faculty of the medical school was in Miami. You looked at the number of dentists who had left, the number of doctors, the number of lawyers, and there was very clearly a brain drain in that early exile. But of course, that was a long time ago, right? So new brains are made, right? New generations are born and so on. So people are talking about a brain drain right now, especially since, you know, the protests that happened in over the last in 21 in 20 and 21, a lot of them were, I mean, the ones in July was a cross section of society, but there's been a group of writers and artists and performers, et cetera, who've been very critical over the last few years. And they protested in November of 2020. They tried protesting since, and they just haven't been able to get very far. And many of them are leaving. And you hear that all the time talking to Cubans. I remember when I did a fair amount of research in I first went back in 1990. And in 1992, I spent 3 months there. And so this was after the fall of the Soviet Union, after, you know, the end of the Cold War. Where was I going with this? Oh, yes. And then I remember, you know, I made friends with a Cuban doctor. And she said to me, I just get tired of saying goodbye to people, you know, and she's now here. She left like 3 years later. And I've been going for so long that I feel like I have generations of friends. So my first friends in those early trips, all of them are gone. And then I made new friends, and then all but one of them are gone, you know, so it does feel like people leave people leave, especially young people. Especially young people. Yeah. Oh, you know, I don't know. Well, apparently they found it in many other places, right? So it's not, I mean, they found it first in Havana, but then since then it's been, you know, found in Korea, in the US. I was spending a lot of time in Havana, and I developed a really strange headache that wouldn't go away. And I kept thinking, could this be Havana syndrome? But I think it's just that I had a fall. But, you know, so no, I mean, my sense is that Cuba doesn't have the technology to do that independently. You know, I mean, I think it's likelier to be Russian, but I have absolutely no evidence of that. That's my gut, but without evidence. What are the chances of a democratic revolution? I think the greatest opportunity for peaceful change that would have eventually been more open was the Obama opening. Because I think, I mean, I was there when he visited, and I felt the sense of hope and possibility. People would tell me, you know, I had a cousin who opened a business. Then then she had to shut it down after the closing, and now she's living in Spain, right? You met all these people who were opening businesses. Young people for the first time were thinking, well, maybe I'll do this. I have an idea for this. And that ended. And I feel like in some sense, it's the same like, with my book, that if you focus on everyday life, there can be change. Because people who have businesses and make connections and meet people, their horizons expand, their expectations expand, and things can maybe, it's not going to be a sudden revolution, democracy, not like that. But I feel like that was the greatest chance for peaceful change. Right now, I don't see that. The government has very, very tight control. Look what, in November, so there were the protests, and you must have all seen the protests in July of last summer, where, it was in over 50 cities and towns across the country. There had been a protest the November before that was mostly intellectuals, about 300 of them, who showed up in front of the Ministry of Culture to demand more voice, more access to media, right? And then there were the protests in July, and then there were protests planned for November of 2021. And the protesters asked, they said, we're not doing anything illegal. The Constitution allows us to have a march. And so they asked the government for permission, and the government said no. And so the main leader decided that rather than, he was just going to walk by himself. He didn't want to cause violence, so he was going to walk by himself carrying a white rose down a street the day before the planned protest. So the government surrounded his house and basically didn't let him leave. So there's all these pictures of him looking through the louvers of his window, holding the rose. And then the government had people go to the roof, take a big flag and unfurl it so that no one could see him. And so, the government can do that. Like how the repressive machinery is really, really powerful. The top dog? No, there has to be, but it might still be Raul, who, although, what? He's still alive, but he spends a lot of time in Santiago, not in Havana. But when those protests happened in July, the president didn't handle it very well. So there was talk, but how many rumors and talks, how much rumor and talk has there been over 60 years? So I don't know.
Who is the current president of Cuba?
Miguel Diaz-Canel is the president of Cuba.
Yeah. I mean, there's a new close list between Russia and Cuba now. And it's interesting when Obama was engaged in the opening, and there's a really great book by Ben Rhodes, who was, in the Obama administration and was the architect of the Cuba policy. He wrote a memoir, what was it? I forgot, of his time in the White House, The World as It Is. And he's got a really interesting chapter or two on the Cuba negotiations. And one of the things that he talks about is how, all these secret negotiations that happened, a lot of them in Canada, there were always people watching them, and they were always the Russians. I mean, the Russians were the ones who stood the most to lose and who most opposed it. But Russia's busy right now. So yeah. And China, they have good relations with China. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in terms of like commercial relations, and Venezuela, Nicaragua are still important. China, Russia. Yeah. 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 Yeah, they're investing all over Latin America. I don't, it'd be interesting to compare how much they're investing in Cuba compared to Latin America, probably a little less, but yes, they're very active, the Russians as well. And they're still Canadian, Canadians are still there, the Spanish, Italians, but, not the US, obviously. So, yeah.
Hi, okay, so I'm very interested in Cuba, which have been, I built those, ferry system back and forth. The point I'm trying to get to is, we have a close friend here, you may have already met her, daughter of Batista, living here in Long Beach, probably already talked about.
No?
Wonderful people, unlike Batista and so. The point is, my grandparents used to go back and forth a lot. And they had fabulous casinos there. But when you came out of the casino with winnings, the bad guys would take the money. And it wasn't a good way to encourage visitors. So Batista knew that. And my story, and I tell this, and I hope it's true, it's not true, let me know. But he called U.S. company,
Mhm.
Lansky and Siegel and people like that. Can you help us square away this our casinos? Yes, we can. They did. They ended that problem. Somebody tried to steal the money, they were never get rid of it. So it worked for a while. Batista eventually had to leave. I'm a big fan of the study of Navarro and Che Guevara and Castro. But when they left, because of the mafia, it's my understanding that casinos eventually got closed up by Castro because he didn't want anything like that going on. So he killed the whole process of the casinos and the gambling there. Is that still going on? And also, is there a presence in Cuba now? Do you have any awareness of that?
The casinos were closed early in the revolution. There's corruption. I don't know that there's a mafia. I've never seen any evidence of it, but I wouldn't, you can't see that by just walking around and talking to people. One of the things that has happened in the last 20 years is that there's more opening for private businesses, right? Not for huge private businesses, small, really modest private businesses. And those, who has the money to start those? And so what's interesting is, some of it comes from money from relatives abroad, but, I kept hearing all these stories about like the wife of this minister who started a spa and the wife, so there's that kind of corruption and access. But I don't know that I'd call it a mafia though.
Easy way. And this is the first time.
Yeah.
So it's very complex. That's the other. Said at the beginning, founded in the United States. He wasn't in the United States. The United States is. But he was in America.
Yeah. Mhm. Yeah.
That we would somehow. So really, it's really strange.
Mhm.
Television. It's our closest neighbor.
Absolutely, yeah. The sound is great. Well, thank you all. Thank you. I think I'll be signing books out there if anyone wants, yeah.
Should we just grab one?
He knows, yeah. I have no idea. Oh, sure, wherever you want, yeah.
Hey, Jim.
Jen?
Hey, Jim.
I can't wait to read your book.
Oh, great.
Oh, Mom, sorry.
I don't mind at all.